The town of Ember Hollow sat where a cold lake met warm hills, and everyone there knew the sound of a furnace roaring to life before dawn. Scott Hunter had built his glass-blowing studio on the north side of Main Street 11 years ago. Brick by brick, breath by breath. He built it the year after he lost the only man who ever understood him. His mentor, his partner in every sense a young man could have a partner, gone in a single winter to a heart that simply stopped. Scott didn't talk about that year. He didn't talk about much. He let the fire speak for him. Every morning, before the town woke, he opened the studio doors and let the orange light spill onto the sidewalk like a secret. The regulars said Scott Hunter's glass had a soul in it. They didn't know it was grief, shaped and cooled and sold in careful pieces. He liked his life quiet. He liked it small. He liked it exactly the way it was. Until the day the old bakery across the street went up for lease, and a moving truck pulled in with a furnace crate stamped Kip Mercer. Mercer Glassworks. Kip Mercer was 28, restless, and completely unwilling to let anyone tell him he didn't belong somewhere. He'd spent 6 years chasing a dream that kept slipping out of his hands, an apprenticeship that ended badly, a mentor who called his work technically fine, emotionally empty, a heart that still stung from both. Ember Hollow was supposed to be his fresh start, a town small enough that a new studio could actually mean something. He didn't know, when he signed the lease, that the best glassblower in 3 counties worked directly across the street. He found out the hard way, standing on the sidewalk at 6 in the morning, watching a shirtless, sweat-shined man pull a molten orange bloom out of a furnace like it was nothing, shaping it with the kind of ease that made Kip's own hard-won skill feel like a child's finger painting. Kip's stomach dropped. Then, infuriatingly, his heart did something else entirely. Great, he thought. The most talented man I've ever seen. And he's also the most beautiful. Perfect. Just perfect. He didn't introduce himself that day. He went back inside his half-unpacked studio and unpacked his anger instead. And underneath it, something warmer, something he refused to name. Scott noticed the new sign within the hour. Mercer Glassworks. Hand-painted. A little crooked, defiantly bright red against the old bakery's faded brick. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself that again 3 days later, when a tourist wandered into his studio holding a small glass hummingbird from the new place across the street and asked Scott if he could make something that delicate. Scott's jaw tightened. His hummingbirds had always been his signature piece. It felt, absurdly, like someone had walked into his house and rearranged the furniture. He crossed the street that afternoon for the first time in his life, uninvited by curiosity, invited instead by something sharper. The bell above Mercer Glassworks' door rang. A young man turned from his workbench. Messy brown hair, ash smudged along his jaw, sleeves rolled to sharp forearms, and eyes the color of glass held up to morning light. "Can I help you?" Kip asked, wiping his hands on a rag, already bracing for a complaint about noise, about parking, about something. "You're copying my hummingbirds," Scott said. Kip blinked. Then something flared behind those glass-green eyes. "I've been making hummingbirds since I was 19, Kip said evenly. "I didn't know Ember Hollow required a permit for bird shapes. They're identical to mine." "Maybe," Kip said, stepping closer, chin lifted, "you're just not as original as you think you are." Scott's mouth opened. Nothing came out. No one had spoken to him like that in 11 years. No one had dared. And infuriatingly, his pulse picked up. "We'll see who sells better," Scott said finally, low and flat. "We will," Kip said, holding his gaze a beat too long. "Doors always open, Hunter." Scott left without another word. He didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen Kip watching him cross the street, jaw tight, heart hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with hummingbirds at all. Word spread through Ember Hollow the way it always did. Fast, warm, a little exaggerated. "Did you hear? Scott Hunter's got competition." By the end of the week, half the town had wandered into Mercer Glassworks out of curiosity, and the other half stood outside Scott's studio window comparing prices under their breath. The two studios sat 40 feet apart, furnace glow spilling from both storefronts every evening, and Ember Hollow, quietly, gleefully, began keeping score. Scott hated it. Scott also, though he'd never admit it, found himself glancing across the street more often than any competitive instinct required. He told himself it was reconnaissance. He told himself a lot of things that summer. The town's Founders Festival came every August, and every year for the last decade, Scott Hunter Studio had hosted the festival's centerpiece exhibit. A live glass-blowing demonstration on the lake pier at sunset, tourists and locals alike gathering to watch molten glass become something impossible. This year, the festival committee, trying, they said, to be fair, offered the pier slot to both studios. A live glass duel. 2 furnaces, 2 artists, 1 hour, judged by audience applause. Scott almost refused. Then he saw the flyer taped in Mercer Glassworks' window, Kip's name printed right below his own, and something stubborn and prideful lit in his chest. Fine, he told the committee. I'll do it. Across the street, Kip stared at the same flyer, heart pounding somewhere between dread and thrill. A duel with Scott Hunter, he thought, in front of the whole town. He should have been terrified. He was, if he was honest with himself, a little bit electrified. They didn't speak again until the night before the festival, when Scott, restless, unable to sleep, furnace banked low, stepped outside for air and found Kip sitting alone on the curb across the street, staring up at a sky full of quiet stars. Can't sleep either? Scott asked before he could stop himself. Kip startled, then huffed a small, surprised laugh. Big day tomorrow. Apparently I'm supposed to lose gracefully to the town legend. You could just lose, Scott said, and something in his voice wasn't entirely serious. Not really my style, Kip said, glancing up at him. In the dark, without the anger, without the audience, his face looked younger, softer, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Scott hesitated, then crossed the street and sat down on the curb beside him. An arm's length apart, close enough that the summer air between them felt warmer than it should. Why glass? Scott asked quietly. Kip looked surprised by the question. Then he looked down at his own hands. Because it's the only thing I've ever made that felt like it was actually mine, he said. My old mentor, he had opinions about everything. What I should make, how I should feel about it, who I should be. Glass was the one place he couldn't touch. Even when he said my work was empty. He paused. Guess I've been trying to prove him wrong ever since. Scott was quiet for a long moment. My mentor died, he said finally. 8 years ago. He was... Scott's throat worked. He was more than a mentor. And after he was gone, I built all of this. He gestured at the dark studio behind him so I'd never have to feel that empty again. Turns out you can build a very beautiful, very lonely room. Kip turned to look at him, something soft breaking open in his chest. I'm sorry, Kip said, and it wasn't a rival's voice. It was just a person's voice, gentle and true. Don't be, Scott said. It's the first time I've said it out loud in years. Their eyes held in the dark. Neither of them moved. The whole street was silent except for the far-off hush of the lake. For what it's worth, Kip said softly, your hummingbirds are still better than mine. Scott huffed a laugh. Real. Surprised. The first genuine laugh Kip had ever pulled out of him. Don't get used to me admitting things, Scott murmured. Wouldn't dream of it, Kip said, smiling. And for one unguarded second, his eyes dropped to Scott's mouth before he caught himself and looked away, cheeks warm. Scott noticed. Scott's own heart did something complicated and unfamiliar. They sat there a while longer, saying nothing, saying everything, until the stars started fading and it was time to go rest before the town watched them become rivals again. The pier was strung with warm lights by the time the festival crowd gathered that evening. 2 furnaces stood 20 feet apart, orange light licking against the darkening lake. Scott and Kip stood on opposite sides, tools in hand, 100 faces watching between them. The mayor gave a short speech. Somebody's dog barked. And then the hour began. Scott worked the way he always did, precise, contained, every movement economical and sure. He shaped a swan, wings caught mid-lift, glass so clear it looked like it might take flight off his pontoon rod. Kip worked differently, looser, bolder. He shaped a piece that started as nothing recognizable. A swirl of blue and gold that the crowd murmured about, unsure what it was becoming. Until, in the final 10 minutes, it resolved into 2 hands, cupped together, holding a small flame. The crowd went quiet. Then they went loud. Scott, glancing over midshape, felt something crack open in his chest at the sight of it. It wasn't technically flawless. It didn't need to be. It was alive in a way his careful swan wasn't, and he knew it, and something in him, some old frightened part, wanted to look away and couldn't. When the hour ended, the applause was close, almost even. The judges called it a tie. The crowd laughed, delighted. Scott and Kip stood at their furnaces, breathless, sweat-soaked, staring at each other across 20 feet of firelight. And for the first time, neither of them looked like a rival looking at competition. They looked like two men who had just seen something true in each other. After the crowd dispersed, after the mayor handed them both a ridiculous joint trophy shaped like a lake trout, Scott found Kip alone on the pier's edge, cooling piece still in his gloved hands. Hands in flame, Scott said, nodding at it. What's it called? Kip looked down at the piece, then up at Scott, something vulnerable crossing his face. I didn't have a title going in, Kip admitted. But watching you work tonight, he stopped, swallowed. I think I'd call it heated rivalry. Because I came to this town ready to hate you. And somewhere in the last 2 weeks, that turned into something I don't have a word for yet. Scott's breath caught. Kip, you don't have to say anything, Kip said quickly, panic flickering. I needed you to know it wasn't only about the trophy for me. It stopped being about the trophy days ago. Scott stepped closer, closing the distance the whole town had watched them keep for 2 weeks. It stopped being about the trophy for me too, Scott said softly. Somewhere around the curb. Somewhere around you telling me I wasn't as original as I think I am. Kip huffed a wet, surprised laugh. You're never going to let that go, are you? No, Scott murmured, reaching up to brush a smear of ash from Kip's jaw, his hand lingering. I don't think I'm going to let a lot of things go now. Kip's breath caught at the touch. Scott, can I kiss you? Scott asked, voice low, honest, stripped of every careful wall he'd built in 8 years. Kip's answer was to close the last inch of distance himself. The kiss was soft, careful. Two men who had spent 2 weeks guarding themselves finally, gently, putting something down. The lake lights shimmered against the water behind them. Somewhere, faintly, the last of the festival crowd cheered for fireworks that had nothing to do with the two men on the pier, and everything to do with the fire that had just quietly, finally, caught between them. They didn't announce anything right away. Ember Hollow figured it out on its own, the way small towns always do. Scott's studio lights staying on later than usual some nights, Kip's bicycle leaning against Scott's door in the mornings, the two furnace glows on Main Street somehow, gradually starting to feel like one warm light instead of two competing ones. 6 weeks after the festival, a customer wandered into Mercer Glassworks looking for a hummingbird and found instead a joint piece in the front window. Scott's precision and Kip's boldness melted into one impossible shape, blue and gold and clear all at once. Two hands cupped around a small, steady flame. Which one of you made this? The customer asked. Kip, leaning in the doorway of the studio that used to be his rival's biggest threat and was now simply the other half of his street, smiled. Both of us, he said. That's kind of the whole story. Autumn came to Ember Hollow slower than usual that year, or maybe it just felt that way, because for the first time in a long while, Scott Hunter wasn't in any hurry for the season to change. He and Kip had knocked through the old dividing wall between their two storefronts, against every ounce of the town's initial gossip and all of Scott's initial instinct to keep his life small, and built one long, warm room with two furnaces glowing side by side. Hunter Mercer Glassworks. The new sign read, hand-painted, slightly crooked, exactly the way Kip liked it. Some evenings, tourists still asked which of them made which piece. Scott had stopped minding the question. He liked now that the answer was rarely simple. Some nights, after the doors closed and the furnaces banked low, they sat together on the same curb where they'd first told each other the truth, shoulders touching now instead of a careful arm's length apart, and watched the lake go dark and quiet under a wide, warm sky. Regret it? Kip asked one such night, resting his head against Scott's shoulder. Losing your solo sign, sharing the room, all of it. Scott pressed a kiss to the top of his head. Unhurried, certain. The room was never as good empty, he said. I just didn't know that until you showed up across the street and told me I wasn't as original as I thought. Kip laughed, soft and warm against him. I stand by it. I know, Scott murmured. That's exactly why I love you. Kip went still for half a second, then looked up, eyes bright in the dark. Say it again. I love you, Scott said. Simple, sure. No furnace heat. No rivalry. No old grief standing between the words anymore. Just two men on a curb, and a whole warm life stretched out in front of them. I love you too, Kip whispered back. Heated rivalry and all. Behind them, through the window, the two furnaces glowed steady side by side. No longer two separate fires competing for the same street, but one warm light, built slow, built true, built to last. Winter came to Ember Hollow wrapped in wood smoke and lake fog, and Hunter Mercer Glassworks glowed warmer than any other window on Main Street. 3 months had passed since the festival. 3 months of shared furnaces, shared mornings, shared curbs under shared stars. Scott Hunter had spent 8 years building a life meant to need no one. He hadn't realized how much lighter it felt to be wrong. But some winters don't stay gentle. And some ghosts don't stay buried just because a man finally let himself be happy. It started with a letter. Kip found it first, propped against the studio's front register on a gray Tuesday morning. Heavy cream paper. A gallery letterhead from the city, addressed to Scott Hunter, Hunter Glassworks. Not Hunter Mercer. Just Hunter. Kip's stomach dropped before he even opened it. He told himself it was an old mailing list error. He told himself that right up until Scott read it standing at the workbench, and his face went carefully, dangerously blank. What is it? Kip asked. The Alden Gallery, Scott said slowly. They want to feature a solo winter collection. 12 pieces. My name on the show. Kip felt something cold slide through his chest. The Alden was the gallery every glass artist in 3 states dreamed about. It was the gallery Kip's old mentor had shown in twice and never let him forget it. That's incredible, Kip said, and meant it, even as his voice came out thinner than he wanted. It's addressed to me alone, Scott said carefully, watching him. I didn't ask for that. I know, Kip said quickly. I know you didn't. But something had already cracked quietly open between them, small and cold, and neither of them said its name. It got worse before it got better, the way these things always do. Scott, hunched over the Alden specifications that night, muttered without looking up, they want the Swan series. The early pieces. Before. He stopped himself. Before me, Kip finished quietly. Scott's head came up. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Kip's jaw tightened, old wounds. Technically fine, emotionally empty. Rising hot and unwelcome in his throat. They want the Scott Hunter who worked alone. The legend. Not the guy who shares a wall with somebody who used to sell hummingbirds out of a bakery. Kip, I'm happy for you, Kip said, and it was true, and it was also, somehow, the loneliest sentence he'd said in months. I just need some air. He left. The bell above the door rang too loud in the quiet studio, and Scott stood alone at his workbench for the first time in 3 months. The old, familiar silence suddenly unbearable in a way it had never been before Kip filled it. Kip walked the lake path in the cold until his hands went numb, and somewhere between the third bench and the boathouse, he stopped lying to himself about why the letter had hurt so much. It wasn't about the gallery. It was about 6 years of being told his glass wasn't good enough alone, and now watching the man he loved get handed, without even trying, the exact validation Kip had spent his whole career chasing and never caught. It wasn't fair to feel that way. He knew that. He felt it anyway. He sat down hard on the frozen boathouse steps and put his head in his hands, and that was where Scott found him 20 minutes later, breath fogging, jacket half-buttoned, having run the whole way once he realized how long Kip had been gone. Hey, Scott said softly, easing down beside him. I'm being ridiculous. Kip mumbled into his hands. You're not, Scott said. I should have said something the second I opened that letter. He exhaled, watching it cloud in the cold air. I've spent 8 years being just Scott, alone in that studio, and some old, scared part of me heard solo collection, and thought maybe that's still all I'm supposed to be. Kip lifted his head, startled. That's not what I wanted you to feel, he said quietly. I know. It's not about you, Scott said. It's about a version of me that's scared that if I let this, he gestured between them, at the whole warm, shared life they'd built. be the real thing, I'll lose it the way I lost him. And some nights it's easier to imagine going back to alone, because alone never breaks your heart twice. Kip's chest ached at the rawness of it. He reached over and laced his cold fingers through Scott's. I don't want the Alden if it means going backward, Scott said, voice low. I don't want anything that puts a wall back up between us. Not even a gallery. Don't turn it down for me, Kip said immediately. Scott, that show could change everything for you. So could this, Scott said, turning to face him fully, eyes steady even in the freezing dark. I've had everything before, Kip. Once. I know what it costs to lose it. I'm not interested in a solo collection if it means I go home to an empty half of the room. Kip's breath caught. Then don't go home to an empty half. Call them back. Tell them the truth. What's the truth? Kip managed a small, watery smile. That Hunter Glassworks doesn't exist anymore. There's only Hunter Mercer. And if they want the fire, they get both furnaces or none. Scott huffed a laugh, something loosening in his chest for the first time all day. You're impossible, he murmured, pulling Kip closer. You love that about me, Kip whispered back, leaning into him at last, the cold forgotten between them. The call to the Alden Gallery happened 3 days later, on speakerphone, both of them crowded around the studio's old wall phone like teenagers. We'd need to see both artists' work, Scott said, steady. Sure. It's not a solo show. It's Hunter and Mercer or it's not us. There was a pause on the line long enough that Kip's stomach flipped. Send us both portfolios, the gallery director said finally, sounding faintly amused. We'll take a look. The line clicked off. Scott and Kip stared at each other in the sudden silence, then broke into the kind of laughter that comes from relief and nerves and love all tangled together at once. We might have just talked ourselves out of the biggest opportunity of your career, Kip said, breathless. Maybe, Scott said, tugging him close by the front of his jacket. Or maybe I just talked myself into the only kind of career I actually want. One with you in it. He kissed him then, slow and certain, 3 months of quiet fear finally, fully letting go. 6 weeks later, a second letter arrived, thinner this time and addressed finally correctly. Hunter Mercer Glassworks. Inside was a formal invitation. 12 pieces, both artists, opening night in spring. The gallery director had added a handwritten line at the bottom. Your combined work has more heat than anything solo I've seen this year. Bring the fire. Kip read it twice, then looked up at Scott with eyes bright and wet. We did it, he whispered. We did, Scott said softly, pulling him into a slow, warm embrace, chin resting on the top of Kip's head, the old studio glowing gold around them. Both furnaces, exactly like we said. That spring, on opening night at the Alden Gallery, 12 pieces stood under careful gallery lighting, swans beside bold blue gold blooms, precision beside daring, 2 entirely different hands that had somehow, over one heated year, learned to make something neither of them could have made alone. The centerpiece stood in the middle of the room on its own pedestal. 2 glass hands, cupped together, holding a small, steady flame. The placard beneath it read simply, Heated Rivalry S. Hunter K. Mercer. Some fires are worth sharing. A reporter asked them, near the end of the night, which one of them had made it. Scott looked at Kip. Kip looked at Scott. Neither of them answered right away, they didn't need to. Their joined hands, resting easy between them, already had. A year is a strange thing to measure a life by, and yet Ember Hollow measured everything by its festivals. And so it was the festival that told Scott Hunter a full year had passed since a stubborn young glassblower had told him he wasn't as original as he thought. The banners were going up on Main Street again. The lake was warming. And Hunter Mercer Glassworks, one long room with 2 furnaces glowing steady side by side, was, for the first time in either man's life, exactly enough. Until the letter came. The second kind of letter that year, not from a gallery this time, but from a landlord, and far more frightening. They're selling the block, Scott said, staring at the notice in his hands like it might rearrange itself into different words if he looked hard enough. Kip came out from the back room, wiping ash from his fingers, and read over his shoulder. His stomach dropped clean through the floor. Both buildings? Kip asked. Ours and the old bakery side? Both, 60 days to make an offer before it goes to open auction. Scott's voice was carefully even, the way it always got when something underneath him was cracking. Otherwise, some developer buys it and turns it into vacation condos. Kip sat down hard on the workbench stool. A year ago, this would have been simple: 2 rivals, 2 separate leases, 2 separate futures, easy to walk away from on their own. Now it wasn't simple at all. Now it was the room where they'd fallen in love. Now it was home. Can we afford it? Kip asked quietly. Not alone, Scott admitted. Not either of us alone. The word hung between them, heavier than either of them expected. Alone. The word that used to be Scott's whole life philosophy. The word Kip had learned over one long, heated year to stop being afraid of. Together, though, Kip said slowly, testing the shape of it. We could maybe afford it together. Scott looked up at him, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. That's not just a business decision, Kip, he said quietly. If we buy this building together, that's not a lease anymore. That's not something either of us can walk away from clean if it doesn't work. I know, Kip said, holding his gaze steady. I'm not asking for clean. I stopped wanting an easy exit around the time you sat down next to me on that curb a year ago. Scott's breath caught. They didn't decide that night. Some decisions, Scott had learned the hard way once before, deserved more care than that. Instead, 3 days before the festival, Scott drove 2 hours to the city. Alone, telling Kip only that he had an errand, and walked into a small, quiet jewelry shop with a photograph of 2 glass hands cupped around a flame tucked into his jacket pocket, showing the jeweler exactly what he wanted the ring's setting to echo. He didn't tell Kip. Not yet. Some things, he'd decided, deserved a festival of their own. The morning of Ember Hollow's 2nd annual Pier Duel, a familiar car pulled up outside Mercer Glassworks. Familiar to Kip, at least, in the worst possible way. His old mentor. The man who'd once called his work technically fine, emotionally empty, stepping out onto Main Street looking older, grayer, and strangely unsure of himself for a man who'd once seemed to Kip larger than the whole glass-blowing world. Kip, the older man said, hesitant. I saw the Alden show right up. I was in town for the festival and I wanted to see it in person. The piece with the hands. Kip's chest tightened, old hurt rising fast. Why? Because I was wrong, his old mentor said simply, quietly. Your work was never empty, Kip. I think I just couldn't see what was missing was never in you. It was around you. You needed somebody to build with. I watched that write-up talk about heat and rivalry and partnership, and I thought, that boy finally found the other half of his fire. Good for you. Kip's eyes stung. Unexpected. Overwhelming. A year of proving himself, and here, finally, was the apology he never thought he'd get. Not because he needed it anymore, but because closing an old wound, even one that had already healed, still mattered. Thank you, Kip said, voice thick, for saying that. Bring the fire tonight, his old mentor said, echoing, without knowing it, the gallery director's words from months before. He gave a small, genuine smile. I have a feeling you will anyway. That evening, the pier filled with warm lights again. 1 year almost to the day since Scott and Kip had stood 20 feet apart as rivals and ended the night as something else entirely. This year there was no duel. There was one furnace, one shared workbench, 2 sets of hands shaping a single enormous piece together in front of the whole town. A sculpture that started as tangled color and slowly, patiently, resolved into the shape of Ember Hollow's own skyline. Main Street's 2 studio windows glowing gold at its center. The crowd murmured, delighted, recognizing their own town taking shape in fire and glass. When the piece was finally set to cool, Scott set down his tools, turned to Kip in front of the whole gathered town, and did not let himself hesitate. A year ago, Scott said, voice carrying in the warm evening hush, a very stubborn, very talented man told me I wasn't as original as I thought I was. He was right. I'd spent 8 years building the same beautiful, careful, lonely room, and I thought that was the whole shape my life was ever going to take. Kip's breath caught. The crowd had gone very quiet. Then he opened a studio across the street. Scott went on, reaching into his jacket pocket, hand not quite steady, and every single thing I thought I knew about being enough on my own turned out to be wrong. I don't want 2 furnaces standing on opposite sides of a street anymore. Kip, I haven't wanted that in a long time. I want one room, one name on the door, one whole life, built with you instead of around some old grief I mistook for safety. He dropped to one knee. The whole pier seemed to inhale at once. Kip Mercer, Scott said, voice cracking open, honest all the way through, will you marry me? Kip stood frozen for one full, disbelieving second, then let out a broken, joyful laugh, both hands flying to cover his mouth, eyes bright and overflowing. Yes, he said, then louder, laughing through tears, yes, Scott. Yes, the whole town erupted. Somewhere near the front, Kip's old mentor was wiping his own eyes, unashamed. Somewhere behind them, the enormous glass skyline sculpture caught the last of the sunset and glowed like it, too, was celebrating. Scott rose, slid the ring, it setting two small hands cupped around a tiny captured flame, onto Kip's finger, and kissed him, slow and certain, in front of the whole warm, cheering town that had watched them go from rivals to something neither of them had words for a year ago, and now, finally, did. They bought the block together. Both buildings, one long room, one sign, hand-painted, slightly crooked, exactly the way Kip liked it, reading simply, Hunter Mercer EST together. Some evenings, tourists still asked which of them had made which piece hanging in the window. Neither of them ever gave a simple answer anymore, and neither of them ever wanted to. Some nights, long after closing, they still sat together on the same curb where it had all begun. No careful distance between them now, no old grief standing guard, no rivalry left except the gentle, teasing kind that comes from loving somebody long enough to know exactly how to make them laugh. Regret any of it? Kip asked one such night, wedding band catching the last of the furnace glow through the window behind them. The rivalry, the letters, the whole complicated mess of it? Scott pressed a kiss to his temple, unhurried, sure, home in every sense a man could be. Not one heated second of it, he murmured. Best rivalry I ever lost. Kip laughed, warm and bright against him, and above them, the lake sky opened up wide and full of stars, watching over one long, warm room, two furnaces glowing steady as one. Built slow, built true, built at last to last. That's the full story of Scott Hunter and Kip. Thank you for watching their journey from rivals to forever. Which part was your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. Like if this heartfelt gay romance made your heart race red heart. Subscribe for weekly gay love stories, emotional connection, slow burn romance, and healing journeys every week.